Good morning. My name's Andrea. I will be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 4. Let us read about the capture of the ark by Israel's enemies, the Philistines. Now the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Apnech. The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh, so that it may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies." So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim. Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all Israel raised such a great shout that the ground shook. Hearing the uproar, the Philistines asked, "What's all this shouting in the Hebrew camp?" When they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid. "A god has come into the camp," they said. "We're in trouble. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Woe to us! Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They're the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the desert. Be strong, Philistines. Be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight." So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. That same day, a Benjamite ran from the battle line and went to Shiloh, his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he arrived, there was Eli sitting on his chair by the side of the road, watching, because his heart feared for the ark of God. When the man entered the town and told what had happened, the whole town sent up a cry. Eli heard the outcry and asked, "What is the meaning of the uproar?" The man hurried over to Eli, who was 98 years old and whose eyes were set so that he could not see. He told Eli, "I have just come from the battle line. I fled from it this very day." Eli asked, "What happened, my son?" The man who brought the news replied, "Israel fled before the Philistines, and the army has suffered heavy losses. Also, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured." When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell backward off his chair by the side of the gate. His neck was broken, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He had led Israel 40 years. His daughter-in-law, the wife of Phinehas, was pregnant and near the time of delivery. When she heard the news that the ark of God had been captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she went into labor and gave birth, but was overcome by her labor pains. As she was dying, the woman attending her said, "Don't despair. You have given birth to a son." But she did not respond or pay any attention. She named the boy Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel because of the capture of the ark of God and the deaths of her father-in-law and her husband." She said, "The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." In times of loss, I'm trying to relate this to kind of what we're going through today. We know that Eli having served Israel for 40 years, was accustomed to the many battles that had gone on between the enemies of the Israelites. And God had been there for them. But something was changing. Something that, as we learned earlier in this history, was making God unhappy. We learned about Hophni and Phinehas and how they became, in God's eyes, wicked, and how Eli failed to provide proper supervision or correction to his sons. But what about the loss during a war or an epidemic, a pandemic, if you will? People that we know dying, we feel loss, as Eli must have felt over the loss of his sons, perhaps, but mostly because of the loss of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, we all experience loss, as I said. We all feel deep pain, perhaps abandonment by God. We all have our precious items that we hold dear that may have been taken from us or destroyed. How do we react? How do we react and still have the faith and the courage that God is still with us? He's protecting us even when days seem dark and scary. He is there with us in our camp. And even though the Philistines carried away the most precious thing there was to Eli, God was still with the people of Israel. And God is still with us today. Peace.